Okay, Nicole, thank you for coming onto the podcast today. I really appreciate you giving up the time.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm excited to be here and chat with you.
Yeah, it's great. I absolutely love your content and how you provide such great intuitive eating messaging for parents and how they handle it with their kids. So I've been really looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Well, thank you.
Can you please just give us a bit of an introduction into who you are and what it is that you currently do?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, I'm Nicole Cruz. I'm a registered dietitian and a mom to three kids myself, who are now 10, 7, and 5. And I got into nutrition because I had a complicated, disordered relationship with food in my teens and early 20s. And I went through a whole process of healing my relationship with food and felt very strong in that and started helping others as a dietitian heal their relationships with food. And then I had kids, what did I say, 10 years ago. And I found that being at a lot of preschool events, at the sports things, with my mommy and me friends, all of those things, I could just see how much stress there was around food and kids. And
Hmm.
so I had done a little bit of family work in the past, but I really started to dive a lot more into helping parents just raise kids to be intuitive eaters because I was seeing so much mixed messaging just come from parents wanting to do the right thing, right? Wanting their kids to be happy and healthy and feel good, but really seeing how some of that messaging was translating. And I was seeing the same sorts of disordered talk in my teen and adult clients, talking about their childhood or the way they were viewing food in my practice, I was seeing that kind of the same way that I was seeing these parents talking to their young children. And so now my practice revolves around doing one-to-one nutrition therapy essentially for clients that are struggling with eating disorders or any sort of disordered eating or just wanting to quit dieting and really embrace their intuitive ability to eat, as well as I work with parents of younger children, about 2 to 12 years old, and I don't work with the kids themselves. I work all with the parents on how
Yeah,
they're handling food and the dynamics around food in their home and in the world.
perfect. Yeah, I can see why there would be such a an interest for you to go deeper into that field because, as you said, with like the mummy and me talk and the pressure around parenting and making sure their kids get good food,
Yeah.
it seems like a never-ending chat. Particularly with the fear mongering, well, not fear mongering, I guess, but the concerns over health and our health as nations. The US and UK seem to have fairly similar lines of like
Mhm.
childhood rates of obesity and things like that. And you and I are obviously both connected in terms of the intuitive eating rhetoric and also the health at every size model.
Right.
So there's a lot of concern there from parents who want to give their kids the best start in life, but then that almost because of the media and the world we live in leads to them being hyper vigilant about treat food and processed food and almost passing their disordered eating habits onto their children. Are you seeing that as well with a lot of that chat?
Yeah, absolutely. I talk to parents all the time about how really there's this like strategy piece of it around what am I actually serving my kids? How am I getting them nutrients? What are the foods that I'm providing? Then there's a how am I doing that? How am I providing it throughout the day at meals and snacks? It- how am I talking about it? There's the how. And then there's this real piece of us. And I say it's like our energy. What are our thoughts and us having awareness around really our own stuff when it comes to food and how we can have all the strategy and information and all the tools. But if we're struggling with our own thoughts around food, or our own relationship with food, or our own views of our kids in food, all of that is going to spill into the feeding relationship. And so we can have all those tips and tools, but we really also have to be aware of our own stuff and do our own work around it as well.
Yeah, because otherwise, if we still have those negative thoughts and biases around those foods, we're going to pass that on sub- subconsciously anyway.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely. Inadvertently, and it's so parents often come to me and they'll just say, like, I just need help with my own reactions. Like, I just find myself getting triggered or frustrated or whatever it is. And sometimes they're very aware, and other times they're not. And what you just said, even subconsciously, I've had so many clients, as teens and adults tell me, I could just feel my mom staring at me when I would go to take that other cookie or get another scoop of ice cream, or the little messages that were sent around chips or whatever it was. They just remember, those messages stick.
Yes. Yeah. And because of course they do. And I guess for the audience as well, remind them about, how intuitive a kid can be with their food intake. I guess if I was coming to you as a parent and I was saying, Nicole, look, I'm really worried about my kid who's their eating habits, and you were trying to educate me on how intuitive they can be with their food intake, what would you tell them?
Yeah. So kids are naturally intuitive eaters when they're presented with a variety of foods. And
Right.
so, right, for adults, it's like, well, okay, we can think through more complex topics. Like I always say, like feeding is a complicated job because we as adults can think through, oh, I'm not going to be able to eat for a couple hours. I might want to make sure it's more substantial, or, whatever that might be that we're going to take into account. Kids tend to be more impulsive. So like see something, get it, grab it, just want it in the moment. And they're also they seek out comfort. So they're going to reach for the things that they know are comfortable. The things, I don't know if you've ever seen on like Instagram or Facebook or whatever, where people put up those graphics and it's like a goldfish cracker, right? It's like, it's always the same. It's always crunchy. It always looks the same. It's always the same color. That's just easy for kids. It's comfortable. Whereas something like a blueberry or a strawberry, they don't know, what is this one going to taste like? Is it going to be sour? Is it going to be sweet? Is it going to be mushy? What's that going to be like? So kids seek out what's comfortable. And so it's easier for them to gravitate towards crackers and things. And so I say kids are intuitive when a variety of foods are presented to them and they're exposed to them, and we continue to support that feeding relationship. But if we're hands off and we're just leaving it all on the kids, they're not necessarily going to be intuitive because they're usually going to gravitate towards what's comfortable for them, towards what's convenient. They're not going to think through things. But they really do have the ability to tune in and listen to their bodies. And we usually say to look at that over the course of a week or so. It's not that every day or every meal they're going to show up and have what we would consider to be these, perfectly balanced meals with all the nutrients there. And I see that with my kids all the time. They'll go through phases where I remember my daughter, and she still does this to some degree, she would just want protein at breakfast. I would just notice she would eat a ton of eggs. Lately, it's more like sausages and things. She doesn't want eggs as much, but she'll eat a lot of protein, but not a whole lot else. But then I'll notice throughout the day, she might gravitate more towards carbohydrates or towards fruits or towards different foods, right? And so they tend to balance out their intake naturally when we don't interfere and start making them, you have to take 2 bites of this, you need to eat that. Like when we can sit back and watch it actually play out. And that's what I tell parents a lot, right? Like actually track food. And I don't want you to be hyper vigilant and crazy and obsessive about it, right? It becomes I got to count the macros and do all the things. But to just take inventory of what your kid's eating over a week, because I'll often have parents come and say like, the kid won't eat any vegetables, or they don't touch this, or all they ever want. And then they do that. And it's like, oh, wait, let me look at what they're actually doing. They did have a few bites of an apple here. They did eat an orange here. They did try the cucumber, whatever it might be. They did eat some cheese and protein. It wasn't just carbohydrates. It wasn't just whatever they're thinking. And so say, look over the course of a week, because they are capable of tuning into their body cues and naturally balancing that out when the food is available to them.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, you need to provide that variety of food for them to be able to know that it's available and make those decisions, rather than just leave your children to just feed themselves.
Yes. Exactly.
No, and a good point as well, as you mentioned, about watching their intake throughout a day and throughout a week, because if you have certain biases over certain foods, or you're concerned about potentially them over consuming certain foods, you might then narrow in on that and think, yeah, my kid is only eating carbohydrates or, sweets, candy. Whereas actually, if you looked at it realistically, you could see that they are having that variety, but it might not just be at every meal, as you mentioned, which I found quite interesting. Your daughter's example of having purely like protein breakfasts, but then eating more carbs through the day, rather than every meal being balanced, as it were.
Right. Yeah. And what you just said, I think, is so important, right? And that's exactly it, is that we often have these biases around food, or we've just come to like, we notice that one time our kid eats a lot of candy or something and it really triggers something in us. And so we're hyper vigilant around that and we're nervous about that. And we're always picking up on how they seemingly want candy or how they never eat the fruit or whatever it might be. And so, we tend to just kind of hone in on that and confirm that story again and again.
Yeah, no, yeah, I bet. And I guess as you mentioned, you have to almost work on your own relationship with food and your own thought processes and biases to avoid that happening because of your own upbringing and the relationship you have with food as a parent is obviously then influenced through years of multiple different sources, which will then come at you because you want your kid to have the best upbringing and growth, and so you're concerned about nutrients and vitamins and health. It's almost like fear but from a place of love.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what I say. I work with the best parents ever. I'm always like, they want the best for their children, right? This is not coming from a bad place. It's coming from, I want my kid to feel good. I want them to be healthy. I want them to be able to eat that variety of foods.
Mm.
It's just that especially our cultural messaging around food and bodies, plays into that as well, plus our own histories. And often we go about that in a way that can take them away from their own intuitive ability to self-regulate and can end up doing damage sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, particularly if you've had parents who have been on diets, multiple diets, different diets, like mine were. It can be, you'll have had your quantity of food commented on.
Yeah.
And then not passing that on to your own children can be difficult because you might be concerned that they're going to be overeating and you have that own messaging about the negative connotations of that. And you have to stop yourself doing it, I guess. What would you comment that on about? Because I've seen you post different things about how to comment about children's selections of food or quantities of food, but in a safe way. Like saying, well, that's not available right now, or could you talk us through a bit about that, I guess, in terms of food selection?
Yeah, absolutely. So I follow the main approach that I take is called the Division of Responsibility by Ellen Satter. And
Okay.
she's a registered dietitian, licensed clinical social worker. And I don't remember where I saw this. I think it was in one of her books. She has multiple books and a lot of information out there. And I remember her telling the story about how she was sitting in a session with a mom and a son, and the mom just said, I just can't get him to eat whatever, or I just can't get him to not eat. And Ellen Satter shares that she just blurted out, like, that's not your job. Like, she was so frustrated with like parents and all of this feeding stuff. She's like, that's not your job. And so she came to develop this approach called the Division of Responsibility, which really lays out the jobs of the parents in the feeding relationship and the children in the feeding relationship. And so while I wouldn't say that I follow everything that she says to an exact T, I found just shifting and developing as I've worked with clients, maybe to be more flexible in some areas or shift a little bit. The overarching approach is always there and foundational. And so I feel like we can't not mention it. So the Division of Responsibility really says that parents decide the what, when, and where of food, and then kids get to decide if they want to eat what's provided and how much they want to eat. So,
Right. Okay.
right. So I like to say it's like set it and forget it. Like the adult is responsible for deciding, what are we having? Tonight we're having spaghetti with meat sauce and broccoli and garlic bread, right? And we are eating at 7 p.m. at the kitchen table. And so it's
Mhm.
like, that's the what, right? The spaghetti and all the food, the when, 7 p.m., and where at the kitchen table. So this is what's
Yes.
happening. We put the food down. Now that's the set it and forget it. You've put it down. Your job is done. And now it's your child's job to navigate the food from what you have provided. And that's, again,
Right.
going back to how we're setting them up, right? To have a variety of foods available to support them and getting that nutrition.
Yeah.
But then we're allowing them from that space to be intuitive, to listen to, what of these foods do I really feel like right now? Maybe I need a lot of pasta right now and that's all they're going to eat. Or maybe they're not that hungry and they just want a little bit of the broccoli or, whatever it might be. So
Mhm.
they get to then tune into their bodies, eat, as much as they want from what's available, or not eat at all if they're not hungry.
Mhm.
So we're setting them up to be able to listen to their body. And when you talk about language, that's what we go back to then. We can, I don't know if blame is the right word, but I often say like blame it on the structure instead of saying like, oh, you really need to eat though. You need to eat your vegetables or you need to eat some food. How could you not be hungry? We can just focus on what the guidelines are, what the structure is and say, "Hey, I get it. This isn't what you were really interested in tonight. I understand. And this is the food that's available. You're welcome to eat it or not." So we're providing that support for them so that we're
Okay.
setting them up to get that variety of nutrients, but we're not forcing or pressuring or any of that. Does that
That
answer
makes
your question?
Yeah, makes total sense. Yeah, makes total sense. And I guess as well then when you're presenting that food, are you presenting it as a smorgasbord on the table of the different foods rather than serving them a set portion?
Yeah, typically that's the recommendation. It's not that it's like there's so many tools that we can use, right? I go back to there's this overarching approach when I say the division of responsibility, which is like you don't ever force your kid to have to eat. You don't cut them off and say you've had enough. Like they get to listen to their body. You're
Mhm.
providing that structure and support. Then there's all these other tools that we can use to help. And so it's not that like plating your child's food, serving them is the end of the world and you absolutely can't do that. But a helpful tool is to allow them to plate the food themselves.
Yeah.
And part of that is, right, it allows them to take ownership. It gives them autonomy. It gives them more control. Kids are always looking for a sense of control. So the more control that we can give them, the better. And the more likely they actually are to eat it if they decide, I want to put it on my plate instead of you putting it in front of them, which feels like another step of like, you need to eat this. You're supposed to eat this. So when they take ownership of it, they're actually more likely to eat it. For a child who feels a lot of pressure around food or who maybe has been pressured, like if you were engaging in practices that said you do need to eat your vegetables, you at least need to try it, and then you're going to adopt this way of feeding,
Mm,
it can be really helpful to not plate at all because when you do put food on their plate, they might feel a sense of pressure, like, "You want me to eat that. I'm supposed to eat that." So the
makes
more
sense.
pressure there has been in the past, the better it is to kind of be hands off. And
Mhm.
all kids are different. I have a client who shares that she has a daughter that she would always just plate the food and it wasn't a big deal. She didn't force her kid to eat it. It wasn't a big deal. She'd just eat what she wanted off her plate, not eat it if she didn't want to and move on. And then her second daughter came through and she would see the food on her plate and she would throw it and she would say, "I don't want this," and flip out about it. I was like, you can't plate her food, right? Two kids, two different ways. You just can't do that because it's setting her up to engage in a battle with you right away. She
Mhm.
stopped plating her food. She started putting everything out family style on platters. And her daughter's eating foods that she never would have eaten before because now she's like, "Oh, maybe I'm interested in that now,"
Right,
right? That's
okay.
that ownership piece instead of like,
Yeah,
"You
yeah.
want me to eat this, so I don't want to do it." So there's just so many dynamics at play when we're feeding
Mhm.
children that allowing them to plate their food can be really helpful.
Yeah, okay. That makes a lot of sense about the decision of availability, um, but then the kids choosing obviously what of that they have.
Yeah.
When it comes to dessert, and let's stick with meal times before approaching like fun foods through the day. But that topic of dessert, like I remember, um, there was a clean your plate, otherwise you don't get dessert type message, and that was only because my mum had that from her, mum and dad. Like they had to have like absolutely everything, and my mum's got quite an amusing story of like a bit of animal fat that her dad kind of like forced her to have, and things like that. So that was passed down. um where do we sit with this when we're trying to bring up our kids with this healthy relationship with food?
Yeah. So again, this is not like an absolute requirement, but a really helpful tool is to actually just serve dessert with the meal at the same time as the
Okay.
other food.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
right, if we're having cookies, put cookies out at the same time that you put that spaghetti and whatever else, right, broccoli and garlic bread out on the table. Put the cookies down at the same time and allow your child to have it whenever they want throughout the meal, right?
Cool.
And so I say it's a helpful tool because it's not a requirement. If you want to serve cookies after the meal and you're not forcing your child to have to eat their food to get the cookies, it's just the way you do it, where it's like, "Oh, cookies come after the meal." That's kind of how you do it in your family. that's fine as long as you're not
Yeah.
making that requirement, but it can be a helpful tool because it helps neutralize foods, right? If we're talking about food neutrality, making foods emotionally feel the same instead of, oh, I have to earn the cookie or I'm supposed to have it later. Or, um, it, you know, for the kids to feel more neutral about it, but it also helps us as parents not get into the I don't want to serve cookies now because they didn't eat any of their dinner and da 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 da. So it can help us also with our own reactions to just
Mhm.
have it out there ahead of time so we don't want to. We're not tempted to start negotiating with our kids about getting the cookie. So just putting it out, having it all out there at the same time, and again, allowing them to be intuitive. And what I find all the time is when parents first start to shift this and they start serving dessert with dinner,
Mhm.
their kid usually is kind of surprised and like, wait, what? I get a cookie now? And, we're allowed to have this before we do my dinner. And they might feel a little excited about it. And they'll
Yeah.
eat the cookie, but then they'll go on and eat whatever else they wanted. And
Sure.
over time, what we usually see, and not always, I mean, some kids are just like, yep, give me the cookie, they eat it, and then they'll move on to the rest of their meal. But what we
Mhm.
see over and over again is that kids will take maybe a bite of the cookie, put it down, want to eat other food, maybe take another bite. So over time, they start to feel more of that sense of neutrality and it just works into the meal. Or kids decide themselves, I don't really feel like a cookie tonight. They don't even eat it at all. Or they decide, well, I want to save it for after the meal, right? Like they decide that though, once it becomes more neutral and available. And that's what I say all the time about sugar and sweets is that our kids need to feel like they have permission to have it, that they're allowed to have it. And this is true, right? You talk about intuitive eating all the time. As adults, we need to feel like we have permission to have that food because if we don't, then we put it on a pedestal. We often end up trying to restrict it. We end up binging on it later. And when kids are like, when kids deal with sugar and sweets as well, it's the same thing. They need to feel like they have permission so that they feel like they have permission to stop eating it in the moment because they know they're going to get it again. If they don't
Yeah.
feel like they have permission, then they're going to want to eat all that they can in that moment.
Of course. And that, yeah, that makes total sense. It's the same as how we, when we teach adults who we're working with or helping adults making peace with food and granting themselves unconditional permission to eat after years of restriction, it's going to feel like the floodgates are opening in a lot of those because they need to go through that habituation. And I guess that would scare a lot of parents at first if they've been having a set by set food routine. If they then go for this open platter and they see their kids reaching for more, high sugar, high fat foods, they might panic and think, "Oh no, this is the wrong way to go," because they're having more of them than they think is okay. But obviously, it's them embracing that same attitude of, well, it's almost like the floodgates have opened, but that will settle down over time.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like that pendulum swinging. The tighter that the restriction has been, it's probably going to swing the other way. And we just have to go through that phase and we have to sit with it and we have to trust it and know that we're actually helping them
Mhm.
get in touch with their body and not be so reactive with food, that they need to go through this phase so they can get to that place of being able to listen again instead of reacting to this sense of deprivation or I'm not allowed to have it.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned it like that, because I remember working with clients of mine who go to um, all-inclusive holidays, for example, where the food is literally all there,
Yeah.
and they're recovering from being on diets and such, and talking about talking with them about giving themselves and their kids permission to just, hey, like if they fancied ice cream first, like just go and have ice cream first and just see what happens, and then how they come back and be like, oh my word, like it's the most relaxed I felt on one of these holidays in years because I didn't feel that compulsive fear, and therefore there wasn't that like forbidden fruit effect everywhere. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it's so good. And when you say that, like feeling relaxed, this work is so helpful for parents because
Mm,
it's twofold, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I'm actually setting my child up to be able to self regulate, to listen to their body, to feel good in their body. I know I'm setting them up to have this healthy relationship with food and to have
mm,
balanced behaviors with food, to be a balanced eater. That's wonderful and amazing, and I think that's what we want for our children, and so many parents say, like, "My life is so much easier now. I'm so much less stressed when I don't feel like it's my job to micromanage and get my child to eat a certain way. When I just know what my role is and when the, like, energy around food calms down, it's so much easier on us as parents too.
Yeah.
We get to relax.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's overcoming that fear and thought bias we have in our head over, bad foods and calorie content and all the things that we were basically taught through the messaging that we got, or the diets that we've done through sort of growing up, or our adult life. When it comes to snack food, and fun food, because I posted recently about this idea of, I'm hungry, my mum saying grab an apple, I'm not hungry for an apple, well, you're not really hungry then, and being like, well, I am, but it's, I just don't want an apple. And there are parents who are sort of saying, well, if I did that every time, if I gave in every time my kid was asking for sort of fun food, then they'd have no teeth left, that kind of thing. Where do we stand on this? Is this also a case of, well, if they're just all available in the house, or is it a case of, these are the snacks that are available at this time? Where do we sit on that, Nicole?
Yeah. So it tends to shift over time. So when we're talking about the division of responsibility, I like to think about, as kids are younger, adults have more responsibility and kids have less. And
Mm-hmm.
as they are getting older, we're slowly handing over a little bit more responsibility, so that by the time they're teenagers, late teenagers, and they're going out more with their friends and they're eating on their own, they're taking on more of the responsibility of feeding themselves, so that by the time they are out on their own, they're capable, right? We're not going to hold this division of responsibility until they're 18 years old and they've never made a meal for themselves and say, see you later, go figure it out. And we've been like, control, 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 right? So,
Bye.
yes, exactly.
Oh
Like, go
God,
learn how to make a sandwich. Right?
it was like my university, just living off boiled noodles. No, go on.
Yeah, exactly, right? And so we're slowly setting them up. And what Ellen Satter uses, I like the word, is to be a competent eater. So we're slowly
Mhm.
handing over a little bit more of that responsibility. So I just think that's important to understand, because it looks a little bit different for a 2-year-old versus maybe a 12-year-old in terms of what's available to them. So as kids are getting to be a little bit older, they maybe are going to take on the role of getting their own snacks, from the
Mhm.
cupboard. And so what is in the house is available to them, unless maybe we have practical reasons for not having it. And that's one of the things I talk to parents about a lot, right? Is getting in touch with, why am I making this choice right now? Is it because I'm trying to restrict my child? Or is it because actually I need more bread for later in the week for sandwiches? Like, what's the
Right.
reason there? Right. And so
Mhm.
with kids, there can be limits around, like, hey, please don't eat the X, Y, and Z. I'm saving that for whatever it might be. So I don't want to say, like, just whatever's in the house is free game. We can have practical reasons for asking them to not eat certain foods. But as
Okay.
they get older, they're going to start taking over that responsibility. For a younger child, though, what we want to do is be thoughtful with the choices that we're putting out. So when you say, like, it's only an apple, it doesn't have to be only an apple. What we want to do is put out a variety of foods for snacks. And I say this because one of the members in my program, it's Future Family with Confidence, a collective program. It's called The Collective. Um, she said recently, she's like, well, one of the main things that I've gotten from doing this is that I just can't be so lazy. I'm like, well, yes, you're not lazy. Let's take the judgment away. But the
Yeah.
truth is,
Yeah.
when we're more proactive, one, it makes our lives a lot easier, and two, it better supports our children.
Right.
So when I say that, right, you're going to put out a few different foods. You're not just going to say, eat an apple if you're hungry, too bad, but you might put out an apple, some cheese, some crackers, some peanut butter. And now
Yeah.
here are their choices. So they can choose, I don't feel like an apple, but I do have cheese and crackers, or I only want crackers today, or I want
Yeah.
crackers and peanut butter. And so we want to be thoughtful with, I am choosing foods I know my child enjoys. At
Yeah.
the same time, I'm exposing them to other foods that maybe they're not crazy about, because we know exposure is the key to help kids learn to like foods. They have to become more comfortable with it. They have to see it. If we're never
Mhm.
exposing them to it, they also never have the opportunity to try it. So we
Mhm.
don't just want to cater and only give them cheese and crackers every single day because that's what we know they'll eat. We want to be thoughtful. We want to be supportive. We want to mix it up for exposure, but we never want to serve a snack that's only one food and say, well, too bad if you don't feel like it, that's it. Right.
Mhm.
And we also don't want to serve a snack that, or a meal, and that in any case, that is only food they don't like or have never tried or are not comfortable with. We're not going to
Mhm.
be, we're not going to be unthoughtful about it. We want to be considerate, but not fully cater so that they never try new things.
No, that makes total sense. Yeah, and that's great. A great framework to apply in terms of providing the variety and all, noticing those patterns, I guess. Like if because when I was thinking about this retrospectively, we talk about practical eating as adults, and intuitive eating being that combination of practicality and knowledge and like values and thinking, okay, well, it's, I'm not hungry, but obviously I've got 3 hours of meetings and then my next opportunity is here, so I'm going to eat something that sustains me now. And you could apply that as an adult and think, well, actually, my kid has gotten back from school, they probably had lunch at 12, it's now 3:30, we're not having our evening meal until 6-7, like they're going to be hungry now, that's just totally normal. So let's provide them with a variety of snacks of different sustenance to see what they choose.
Yeah.
So it's a good
Yeah,
way to apply that.
absolutely. And we want to, again, take on that responsibility of deciding the what, when, and where.
Yeah.
And we want to be responsive to our children, right? So if we're like
Right.
noticing they never eat at a certain time, we might need to make an adjustment. If we notice that
Mhm.
they seem really hungry after school, might want to make sure we're serving really substantial snacks. I'll
Mhm.
often make more what we would consider meal food. Maybe it's mac and cheese, maybe it's chicken nuggets, maybe it's quesadillas or grilled cheese, along with some fruits and veggies for an after school snack, because I know my kids come home hungry and then we have
Oh yeah.
practices and then, right,
Yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
just going to
Yeah.
serve some pretzels or something. I'm going to be
Yes.
responsive to, they need a good solid meal at this point of the day, and get it out around that time, right? So I'm not just going to decide an arbitrary time like they get home and so I'm going to wait an hour and then I'm going to serve food. We're going to notice, when are they hungry, where do we need to make adjustments, and what types of foods do I need to serve them? What am I noticing?
Yeah, that's a good point because of their different routines and their what they have on, as you mentioned, if they've got like practices either after school or between that gap of school in the evening. Kids, I remember when I was a teenager in particular, like I was just out, every afternoon, evening, like different
Yeah.
sports and extracurricular activities, like it, as you said, like a school itself as well, with lunch break and with even PE and or phys ed as you'll call it. You're active as heck and you're growing. So you need a lot of nutrition.
Yeah, for sure, and that can be really uncomfortable for some parents too, to
Mm,
watch their child eat what they would consider to be a lot of food, and
mhm,
that's where we really have to do our own work and sit with our own discomfort around, what is our fear around this? What is our concern about the amount they're eating? What comes up for us if they're really hungry, and so many of these
mhm.
things are programmed ideas around, we see governments telling us certain serving sizes are the right size, or
Yeah,
we
yeah.
feel uncomfortable with the amount we feel like we would want to eat if we really allowed ourselves. So there's just all these different influences that can play into our own thoughts about food. But it's really normal for kids to need a good solid amount of food as they're growing.
Yeah, yeah, and think about practicality, the amount of activity that they genuinely will be going through day to day. Like it's a lot, and therefore it is a fear of adults who will probably have desk jobs and not do a great deal of movement outside of their formal
Right.
exercise anymore. Depending on what their roles are as well and jobs, and obviously everyone's different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's what's so beautiful about trusting our kids in all of this is they also go through different phases and they go through different spaces where they're more active or less active. And so how do we actually ever know how much they really need to eat? And
Mm,
how can we, again, let go of that responsibility and really just trust them to feed themselves in the way they need, and trust that at different moments in time, they're probably going to need different amounts. And when we can let go of that, they can build that trust in themselves too, that I know
mhm.
the amount of food I need. I can feed myself. I can stop when I'm done eating. And they can take those lessons, as they continue into adulthood, where so many of us as adults have struggled with not knowing our own hunger or fullness levels, or not, certainly not trusting them even if we feel them.
Yeah, because so many of us, particularly if done diets or things in the past, rely on that external control.
Yeah.
Like calorie counters and serving sizes, as you mentioned. Like, oh well, I shouldn't have I shouldn't have 4 squares of this chocolate bar because there is genuinely a chocolate bar there, because that's over the serving size or whatever message we're big. It's almost great education to explore intuitive eating with your children at the same time, I think, because hearing this from my side, it's almost like that seeing these kids and how they eat their food in different quantities and different needs can almost be that amazing insight into like, oh wow, yeah, like we genuinely just have different needs on a day-to-day basis.
Yes.
Versus this rhetoric we're taught of like, you must carefully and conspicuously control your intake.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think it's really interesting, especially like I have 3 children, and to just see how that varies from meal to meal with all of them. We can sit down and one of them barely touches a meal and another one needs 3 sandwiches that day or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
and it's so variable, and we don't always know, and we don't know what to expect. But I think it can be this relationship with our kids too, that it can be hard to watch at times. And I have so many parents say, it's actually really supportive of their own relationship with food when they can see their child navigating that, and it helps them learn like, okay, maybe I can trust myself too, and they can see their child doing it as well.
Of course. And let's move into that kind of like daytime nutrition and school nutrition, because I think what fears a lot of parents is that idea of like, well, what are my kids being fed at school? And coming from, it might help you to know my background a bit, where I was very heavily into the CrossFit community, and inside the CrossFit community there was a very heavily influence on sort of the Paleolithic diet and clean eating, and so a lot of rhetoric around food processing being the biggest enemy and the cause of all of our problems in life, be it health or financial. And a lot of people I then work with have also had a similar journey where there is just this obsession of like good food versus bad food, right? And if we're having this messaging as adults and we're seeing all of this, and because the media portrays into it as well, like, oh, what junk is being fed our kids and all the rest of it, how do we then, because I know now obviously food processing is a vital part of the world we live in, and foods have a variety of nutrients and energy needs, and that is the world that we live in. But how do we help adults with that fear, I guess, and support our kids through school and help them make choices, or do you see what I mean?
Yes. So what you just said, how do we help adults with that? Part of it is us, again, doing our own work on food neutrality, really looking at what are our fears around these foods, what's coming up for us. It's also us being clear and confident in our role of feeding our kids and knowing like I am doing my job by providing them with a variety of foods. And so sometimes they are going to have more processed foods. Other times I'm going to be serving more, maybe fresh fruits and vegetables and things, and all at the same time. The other thing that I think is so important for us to go back to is this is the world that we live in, and our kids will continue to be exposed to these foods. And so even if you can't get behind those foods are okay, they're fine, they're not bad, they're not a big deal. I think that's part of the work, is neutralizing those foods.
Yeah.
But even if you can't get behind that, it's recognizing that our kids will be exposed to them. So the best way for them to self-regulate is to have that exposure, to be allowed to have them, so that they don't feel like the forbidden fruit. Because when they do, that's actually when they're going to eat them out of balance, because they feel like they're not supposed to, or they feel like they were never allowed to have them. So we
Yes.
can bring them in as just a normal part of the diet, along with lots of other different foods, right? Not just, I'm not saying only feed your child chips all day. Chips and donuts. Here you go. Have at it, right? Like
chips, donuts, chicken nuggets, and pizza. There you go.
That's it, right? That's
the 4
it.
food groups.
No. Those foods are totally fine to have, but
Yeah.
just the same way that we would not only feed our children broccoli and cucumbers all day, right? We need to create this balance of giving them availability to all of it. And that's the best way that they're going to learn to self-regulate over time, is by having access and exposure to those foods that we feel uncomfortable about as well.
No, I love that message because, again, it's a lot of my questions just seem to be themed around a lot of my Facebook content recently. But I posted again a piece of content the other day that was like, just an FYI, guys, you don't necessarily need to have protein at breakfast. You can just have a bowl of cereal. And it was as if like I, you know, set a bomb off on Facebook. The comments I got, cereal's well high in sugar. Like, no, that can't be a good breakfast, and I'll just want loads of sugar later if I eat it. And I was like, well, that sounds a bit like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's dig deeper into that thought. And there was a bunch of that kind of thing going on. And it sounds like, as we've said, the neutrality work is important. The exposure is important to have that variety, because then our kids will see that there's no big deal and they won't eat those in abundance or out of balance, as you mentioned. Going back to breakfast, when you talked about your daughter having like mainly eggs or sausages, are you providing then again, like, breakfast sounds like it's a variety of proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and different food types and textures for them to choose what they'd like at that given time?
Right, exactly. So even this morning, right, our time difference, I just sent my kids off to school. And so this morning for breakfast, what we had was eggs, what I put on the table: eggs, cheese, sourdough bread, butter, and grapes and blueberries. And then they can just decide from that what they want to have, right? And one of my kids did eat only bread with butter and some fruit.
Mm-hmm.
My other child, it's kind of funny because he's usually my bread eater, only ate the eggs with cheese.
Right.
Right. And my daughter came back to the table. She's like, I didn't eat very much this morning. Can I have a few more blueberries when we were getting ready to walk out the door? And I was like, sure. And so I think I was trying to do a bunch of tasks to also pack up their stuff for school. So I didn't really pay close attention to how much she did eat of anything else. But she pretty much just had fruit, I think, this morning. So randomly, right? So it just, and maybe she probably did have a little bit of eggs. So probably a little bit of eggs and some fruit. So those were all the things on the table for everybody. And they all ate slightly different.
Great. I love that. I feel like I'm just learning so much on this podcast, like, and then because it's conversations I have with parents all of the time, because as I said, because I'm not a parent yet, and talking to you about that journey through, because intuitive eating and that message for me has also been a transition over the last sort of 12 months from very much previous diet speak, both for myself and for my clients. I've kind of transitioned from the dark side, as it were. So to have these conversations with parents, because with the individuals themselves, it's really fantastic to give them the freedom to just have a bowl of cereal and find that, oh my word, I'm actually satisfied from my food and I don't have the temptation to binge anymore, because I was teaching them about there's a difference between actually enjoying your food versus what you think you should be having all of the time. Sure. And leading to overeating. So kind of how we can influence our kids in the same way, I find fascinating. Let's talk about Halloween candy, because obviously the theme, many of my fellow intuitive eating accounts have been posting about it, and for good reason, because of that, not just with adults but with their kids as well. There's a big fear about sugar intake, teeth health. And I mean, I feel like we're going to talk about, hey, if these foods are neutral, it's no longer an issue and we need to do the work. But I guess it's just reinforcing that a bit more, particularly as there might be more desire for kids to have that in this time.
There is, right? There is. I think we have to remember a couple of things. One is Halloween itself is exciting, and it's built around getting candy. So of course our kids are going to be interested and feel like it's something fun to get a bunch of candy. So yes, they're probably more likely to want it and eat a bit more this time of year. That's a pretty normal thing. It doesn't mean anything's wrong with our kids. It doesn't mean they're obsessive. It doesn't mean that they're never going to eat anything else. It's just normal. It's normal to want candy. I also see that when kids do have a healthy relationship with sugar and they get it frequently, it's not that big of a deal. They're usually pretty excited the first couple of days when they first get it, because it's like, oh my gosh, what did I get? Look at all this different candy. I don't know about you or any of the other parents listening, but I don't tend to stock my house with like 20 different kinds of candy. So when that comes in for them and they have their bucket, that is exciting to have this variety of things. It also reminds me of, I've gone to the store before and we haven't had maybe strawberries in a little while because it wasn't season or they weren't that great. And my kids are so excited to see the strawberries because we haven't had them in
Right.
a while, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's okay for them to be excited and to want to eat them. So yes, it's a normal thing to feel that, to see that from them. It's normal for them to eat more of it this time of year because it's probably more present and available. And what I really notice is that when we can lean into that and we can allow that, still with structure and support, still with providing them a variety of other foods, the energy around it goes down so much more than when we are trying to run this really tight ship where they can't have it. You know, they brought in all the candy, but they're only allowed to have 2 pieces and they shouldn't have too much. And we don't want them to eat it the next day. We end up getting rid of it or playing. I don't know if you've heard of this or not, but like talk about the switching out your candy where the next day it's gone and a toy appears instead. And we do all
Right.
these
Okay.
practices that are telling our kids, you shouldn't have candy, you shouldn't have too much, it's not good for you.
Yeah.
It actually builds up the energy and excitement even more. So
Of
yes,
course
they're
it
going
does.
to
Yeah.
have it, and I suggest you lean in and allow them to have more than maybe they normally would or more than you're comfortable with, and see what happens. Because again and again, I see parents actually do that and realize that their child relaxes and it's not that big of a deal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's going through that fear to find that outcome, and that's the best way through it, rather than worrying about their teeth health and things like that. Realizing that they are going to moderate those foods, and it's like Christmas, right? You know, there's an excitement around that because the whole holiday is built around that piece. And I think America, Halloween's a pretty big deal here for like youth and things, and I think that's very much since the, because I don't think in the UK it was a massive holiday in comparison to in the US and Canada. And I think like social media has obviously influenced that in terms of like my generation who now have kids as well. And then that's, do you know what I mean? It's kind of like becoming bigger and bigger now that the world's more connected. But no, like that's, you know, this has been so fantastic, full of information. I can't wait to share it with people in my network. I've just been thinking like about how many places I can get this out because I just think it's been so useful. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time and information.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. It's so great to talk with you and connect. And I love that, like you were just saying, the world being connected, that we can do it from, 2 completely different areas of the world. I love it.
Yeah, you know, like my day's just ending and your day's just beginning. So thank you so much, Nicole. I've really appreciated it. I'll obviously share your Instagram handle with the world who have listened to this podcast. Is there anywhere else that you want to send people, or anything that you want to talk about before we, call it a day?
I think Instagram is a great place to find me. I post on there regularly and show up there. And then through there, you can always connect to me in lots of different areas. So I think that sounds good.
Fab. Well, thank you again so much for coming on. I've really appreciated our time together.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.